Well, good morning, everyone in Eastern Central Europe, and good afternoon in Asia Pacific. Thank you for taking the time to join today's session. My name is Pedro Ramos Caramona. I'm the Global Program Manager for the Mycotoxin Management Program at Trouw Nutrition. In this session, we'd like to bring you a summary of the findings on mycotoxin prevalence in 2017 crop, as well as the insights of the novel tools Trouw Nutrition has recently developed to support feed producers and farmers to counteract the negative effects of mycotoxins in animal production. While a recorded version of this webinar will be available, we are keen to keep this webinar very interactive, so be able to address your questions on this specific topic. So feel free to write your questions down in the designated box on the right side, and we look forward to address those questions in the question and answer session at the end of this webinar. So as I mentioned, the goal today is really to talk about the challenges and also the areas of mycotoxin control. A lot of the challenges we have today on the mycotoxin front are certainly related to the fact that we have methods of analysis that are not as effective or reliable or done at the acceptable cost. So that puts some pressure in terms of identifying the real risk at the right time, and certainly to have preventive measures to reduce that risk. When you look at that at the producer level, it also has to do with competitiveness and profitability. So it's important to understand most of the challenges we have today with mycotoxin and their impact are based on basically economic challenges. Therefore, we are obviously at Trouw Nutrition very invested in this area of mycotoxin risk management. As you see on our core programs that we have, feed safety is really key, and within that we have mycotoxin risk management, which I'm basically globally leading. So one of the questions we get for producers and also across the world with the travel is, are we actually able to predict the risk of mycotoxins? And so this is a great question, and I'd like to bring that to a pool today to start the interactive session by asking the following question. So what are the main factors determining mycotoxin production? So we will see the pool. Please take a few seconds to vote on this direction. We'll wait a few more seconds for you to fill in. Seems like 2/3 of you have voted. So it seems like all of you guys vote. And most of you have voted the climate conditions and grain moisture at harvest. So certainly when you look at the challenges related to mycotoxins, it's very relevant to be looking at the pre-harvesting conditions. So either that is doing through crop management, the application of fungicides, or the conditions pre-harvest, or during harvest, we certainly need to be looking at those to be able to essentially manage mycotoxin risk in the following year. We will be using those grains. So when you look at that, prediction is a big word, but it's important that we understand that it's relevant to be looking at the past and just the pre-harvest conditions for the grains we'll be using on the following year. So typically we use several tools that are available online. One of them is the Global Agriculture Monitoring, GeoGlam, that shows the conditions where crops are basically being raised on, and that will have a huge impact on the growth of mycotoxin producing molds like Fusarium, for example, or Aspergillus, and therefore we can somewhat start to have an idea how to manage these problems with around 6 months ahead of time when we see risk happening. So a key few points from what we find out from the 2017 harvest. On the corn side, beside expected record high production in the US and in Canada, currently we're seeing around 87% of the corn crop being harvested already. And beside expecting a huge production, we are seeing that a drought situation that we found, especially in the northern areas, have been impacted or delaying the harvest quite significantly. So we are seeing around 10% of the grains either in poor or very poor condition, which can obviously be reflected in terms of the mycotoxins we find on those grains. Also, dry weather in the Western, South, and Eastern Europe, in particular in Ukraine, which is a really high producing area for corn and also soya, certainly will compromise grain quality. In China, we also saw dry conditions followed by high precipitation at silk stage of corn, which can certainly increase the level of risk for fusarium, for example. In terms of the spring wheat, which is now also being harvested, Canada is showing quite poor conditions during the drought, while soybeans have been in good prospects in all regions that are main producing areas. A quick attention for the next year is also the winter wheat. We know that in the northern hemisphere, there are some mixed conditions, especially in the northern part of Europe, where we certainly see a lot of rain compromising the sowing of this wheat. So we obviously will see these effects later on in 2018, but it's important that you see how related these topics are to the weather conditions we see during harvest. So looking now at what we find out on the last year analysis, we basically had around 9,000 samples in 2016 and around 7,000 samples in 2017. So when you look at that, the distribution is very clear, obviously focusing a lot on the main mycotoxins as aflatoxin, DON, fumonazines as the most prevalent, as well as the Zearalenone. One important thing that we find out also was the fact that some mycotoxins were certainly more prevalent in the 2017 crop, as for example aflatoxin, which was passed on from 81% in the 2016 crop to 91% in the 2017 crop. Fumonazines were actually quite an increase from 44% to 87% of positive samples, and T2 toxin as well. While the levels were found very minor, we saw that there was quite an increase in terms of the prevalence. The opposite happened actually with Zearalenone, and that passed from 56 to 46%. Another important finding that we wanted to share with you is the fact that we see certainly a seasonality effect when you look at toxins. So when you're looking at managing this issue, it's important and relevant that we start being proactive in certain periods of the year where we see higher toxicity coming into grains at the global level. So here you see the example of aflatoxin distribution from 2015 to 2017, equating to close to 20,000 different samples that we took off. But looking only at aflatoxin, you see clearly a distribution from September to March, I would say, so quarter 4 to quarter 1 the following year, you see always a higher incidence of mycotoxins. So when you look at that, it's obviously very key to start preventing, and that's why we're doing the webinar at this stage, is because we're right in the middle of what can be a very good time to think about your program to control mycotoxins or to increase measurement on the toxicity that you see in grains. One of the reasons for that to happen is certainly equated to the carryover stocks we got from 2016, and certainly a great crop, for example, for corn in 2016, which means that we sometimes have a challenge with carryovers or basically challenges in storage of these grains, which will then compromise also the levels of mycotoxins that we see in the field. Now let's look at a few of the key grains. And so we identify obviously corn and wheat, corn and their byproducts and wheat, and later on we'll be looking a little bit what we find in complete feed. So in terms of corn, maize, and their byproducts, we certainly look at 3 mycotoxins as the most prevalent, or the ones that are found in higher levels. So DON, certainly quite prevalent. You can see the distribution there, and quite a straight linear growth as we see from the start of the year until now. So the levels you see there also in the gray bar of 1,000 parts per billion are the ones recommended by the EU, around 800 to 1,000 parts per billion. So we would like to be below those levels in terms of reducing the performance impairment of animals. And you see the 64% of the samples were contaminated with DON, and at levels that could be up to 5,000 parts per billion. But in average, you're looking at 950, which is still above the recommendations by the EU. Looking at zearalenone, you can see the distribution is a little bit less clear, but on the last month, September to October, we see a little bit upwards in terms of the levels we're finding. Average 160 parts per billion, and 25% of the samples in corn were contaminated with zearalenone. Aflatoxin, usually one of the mycotoxins that is mostly tested because of the regulatory impact of that toxin. And so you see 77% of the samples were contaminated with an average of 28 parts per billion. So obviously the level we're looking at as a limit from the regulatory standpoint is 20 parts per billion across the world. So that is somewhat concerning, and we hope that they keep, the levels are keeping lower than that threshold. Now, when you look at the results in wheat and barley, so small grains, most relevant toxins found, as typical, obviously we find DON, and you see the distribution there at DON at average 690, so a little bit lower this year, and 51% of the samples contain that toxin in wheat. At zearalenone, it's very similar to what we find in the corn, and we see around 20% of the samples with the mycotoxins or this mycotoxin above the limit of detection, and the average around 156 parts per billion. So obviously we see maximum levels that are quite compromising, but again, some of them will be outliers. Some of them, as Grafted explained, would be obviously still concerning for us. So as mentioned, it's important also to look at the distribution in feed, and as always, we see co-contamination when we start obviously looking at more complex matrices as feed or silages, for example. So here the take-home message is certainly the fact that we see 70% of the samples containing aflatoxin. The levels in average obviously are reduced because there's obviously a dilution factor from all the ingredients that we see in diets. We also see fumonisin quite prevalent at around 78%, while the levels in average are really not challenging, I would say, by themselves in terms of animal performance. But it's interesting to see this toxin is quite prevalent, and therefore there is going to be interaction with other trichodacins, for example, as DON and T2 toxin, which are also quite prevalent. Point of attention also to T2 toxin and DON, as mentioned, trichodacins that are always quite prevalent. We see a dilution factor from what we find in the individual grains, and that's quite common, but still at levels that can compromise performance impairment, while they are not going to be determinant for clinical problems. For example, they will be undermining profitability at the farm level. So it's important also to be looking at what will be the impact of the findings that we got from all the analysis that was done in collaboration with MuscleLab. And obviously, when you look at that, obviously it depends on the sensibility of the different species. But as a summary, we can realize that, for example, for sow production, for swine production, we would potentially see the main impact being on the feed intake and immune function, as well as reproduction failure, and the decrease in weight gain, for example. So all the toxins that were determinant there are going to impact directly or indirectly on these main points. When you look at poultry, typically because of the quite rapid cycles that we have in broilers, or with later, longer cycles in layers and breeders, we can see increases, for example, in efficiency when you look at increase in FCR, gut health, immune function. And so these are the main points that we need to be quite attent at the farm level to try to diagnose the challenges in 2018 coming in. For dairy cows, obviously more complex diets. We're looking typically at the feed intake, rumen function highly impacted by trichotoxins, but also penicillium toxins, and immune function that obviously will compromise performance at that level and also reproductive failure. So this is important to know as we are on farm with veterinarians and with farm managers to be able to identify the risk as early as possible so that we can prevent and have preventive measures to reduce the impact of mycotoxin contamination. Before we pass it on to Alan, it's important also to then put it all together. So the goal for us is certainly to try to understand the main areas of risk as mentioned before in terms of the pre-harvesting conditions and also type them on with the fact that we also have the data to show us what main toxins are at risk. So the key goal of having a global database is to be able to then generate information that is reliable and is targeted to the different regions we are working on, so that we can advise at earlier stage for the risk that we see on mycotoxin contamination. So here, very brief summary. You can see North America and South America, aflatoxin, DON, and fumonisin as being the most prevalent. We see, as mentioned in Brazil, obviously now not in a really high producing stage, but we see there are very high levels, for example, high prevalence of DON, and you see 77% of the toxins were positive, but 45% of them are actually above the threshold we like to consider as safe for performance impairment. You look at Europe, obviously we know the southern part and western part of Europe identified this year as a risk, especially for corn production, where there is a quite important drought, exceeding more in Ukraine, for example. And you can see, obviously, aflatoxin, DON, fumonisin, and T2 toxin coming at levels that we need to be considering as a risk. In Asia, basically the same, aflatoxin obviously more prevalent at 72%, and 54% of those samples actually came at higher thresholds than what we would recommend as a 20 parts per billion would be for Europe, and for the rest of the globe as the threshold we like to see. DON and fumonisin, as well as in North America, South America, as stated. So interesting enough, for Africa, we see a little bit more prevalence of zearalenone. While 52% of the samples are contaminated, only 10% are showing risk, threshold above the risk we like to consider. So the point now is, we talk about the challenge. The question is now, how can we manage this challenge? And for that, I would like to introduce Alan. Alan is a graduated from the veterinary faculty of Utrecht University and worked in this university poultry health department shortly after graduating. Alan has further developed a particular interest for analytical services by developing diagnostic tests with application in the veterinarian industry. In her present role at Master Lab, the laboratory division of Trouw Nutrition, Alan is responsible for the global mycotoxin analysis services and will present to us our overview of the novel diagnostic tools Trouw Nutrition is developing to support our mycotoxin management strategy in the field. Alan, good morning, and thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, everyone listening, and Pedro, thank you for introducing me, and also thank you for giving this global picture on the mycotoxin levels that we encounter this year worldwide. As Master Lab, which is a laboratory of Trouw Nutrition, we have several feed laboratories all over the world. And altogether, we safeguard the quality of the Trouw Nutrition products. But on top of that, we have developed a tool that can support feed producers to manage their mycotoxin risk, called Nutriop Mycotoxin Advisor. And when you are producing animal feed, there are different steps during which decisions are made on the mycotoxin risk. Here you see three major steps, which is the supply management, the quality control, and the feed formulation phase. For example, during the supply management, decisions on mycotoxin risk are made on what raw materials do you purchase to make animal feed, or what is their origin, or how are they harvested or processed. In the quality control, decisions are made on what samples do you take, how often do you take them, and what method do you use to analyze. During the feed formulation, one of the decisions is on whether or not to add toxin mitigating products. And that brings me to a question to the audience. Which decisions in which phase do you make? Are you involved in? So the question is now open for you, and you are able to choose one or more of these options. Are you involved in supply management? Or are you involved in the quality control program? Or do you make decisions regarding the feed formulation? Now you have some time to answer this question, and we'll wait and see what pops up. And as you are able to choose more than one option, the final results will can be above 100%. So we're curious what will pop up. So please make your vote, and where are you involved in the mycotoxin risk management? That is the question.
Okay, Alan, I see that the poll is closed now. 51% of the people had said feed formulation. Next is quality control at 34%. 29% is supply management, and 17% of the people respond none. So I would say your best, or I would say that from the audience, feed formulation, quality control will be the main ones.
Okay, thank you, Pedro, because I'm not able to see these results. But what I hear from these numbers is that some of you are involved in feed formulation, others are in the quality control, and others in the supply management, which illustrate that during these phases decisions are made on mycotoxins. And that brings me to the following: on what info do you use to make decisions and to manage the risk of mycotoxins? So thank you for your input on the poll, and let's talk about the information that is available. There is a lot of information available from global data and from global surveys that we can use. But also the world is very different for different feed producers. For example, a feed mill producing poultry feed is very different from an integrator producing piglet feed. And how should a fish feed mill or a pet food producer look at the global data? So to be able to judge your own risk, you need to integrate global data, as Pedro has shared with us, with your own data. And also, when you want to react fast, when any changes in the production process are occurring, real-time data are essential. As most of us do not like surprises, and we do not like to wait for analysis results being available. So that was the starting point for Trouw Nutrition in 2014 to build a network of rapid test devices and a global database. Here you see the rapid test device that we are using, the MyCoMaster. The MyCoMaster is a customized lateral flow device that has been validated for many raw materials and animal feeds. And with the MyCoMaster, it is possible to prepare a sample in 10 minutes and read it within 5 minutes, which then gives you the result within 15 minutes after starting the analyzing. And the MyCoMaster, what's even more important, it's customized in such a way that it uploads the results automatically after analyzing. This means that all relevant persons within the company will have immediate access to the data generated by the MyCoMaster. So not only the analyst and the laboratory manager, but also the nutritionist or the purchasing department. But of course there's more, because we do not only like fast data, but we like accurate data as well. And then it's very important to realize that you need an accurate analyzing method, but it's also very important to realize that estimating the true lot concentration in a batch of feed or raw material is influenced mainly by the sampling and preparing the sample. That brings me to the following. How many analysis results do you need to have the precise information on the concentration of mycotoxins in the batches of feed you are processing? And why is this that important? As most of you know and us know, is that mycotoxins are uneven distributed. And let me give an example to illustrate. It is estimated from research that in a batch from maize kernels that has an average of 20 ppb, so 20 microgram per kilogram, only 6 kernels out of the 10,000 are contaminated. 6 out of 10,000. So you can imagine that when only a limited number of samples are taken from this batch, that it is very easy to miss the contaminated kernel and to underestimate the true concentration. This means that based on a limited amount of samples, the prediction of the real concentration and the prediction of the mycotoxin risk is rather poor. And although from theory we know that the right sampling procedure is essential, in reality sampling is not optimal, either because the procedure is not done properly or a very limited number of samples are taken. A way to overcome this is to increase the number of samples. Just again, imagine the batch of maize with 20 ppb of aflatoxin. When testing only 10 samples, the results can vary widely. But when 150 samples are tested, the curve will come much closer to the actual average value of 20 ppb. And when building the global database, we use this principle. The principle of increasing the number of samples to estimate more precise the mycotoxin concentration. So as I said, that was the starting point to build a database and a global database. And this database is growing every day. This picture shows you that we have now more than 125 mycomasters all over the world. And actually today it's even more than 19,000. And every day it is growing as the results are uploaded automatically. That brings me to Nutrient Mycotoxin Advisor. It is a software tool which is using all these data. And within Nutrient Mycotoxin Advisor, all these data are used. But it is more than just a database. Because to be able to manage the mycotoxin risk, you need to interpret the results. You need to translate the concentration into a risk. And then you need to know, okay, what levels do pose a risk to the different animals? In order to do so, you need to look at what are the levels that are risky or have a risk for the different animals. And these levels are very different for the different species. Within the program, these levels can be set, and here you see an overview of the different levels for aflatoxin for different animal species. And what you see here, the default value, are derived from European regulatory levels, but these levels can be set for the organization. As these levels, of course, vary for the different regions and different continents where different regulations may apply. So these levels can be made company specific. And then with these levels, the program enables the user to take its own data and to make a risk calculation. And this calculation is done for a specific commodity like maize, and also when knowing what inclusion rate of the maize is used for making a feed. And I'd like to give you an example to clarify, because a calculation is made in this case for a feed producer making feed for laying hens. And this feed is containing maize in 20%. So this feed produced is for layers, and there is maize included with 20% in this feed. And then the question is, what is the risk of aflatoxin to affect the layer? And with the risk level I just showed, then the program will make a calculation telling that the risk that a final feed will exceed the risk level for layers will be 18%. And with this high level, so 18% of the feed batches for layer may pose a risk to the layer, there is a recommendation given, which is then saying, okay, it is recommended to analyze each delivery of this feedstuff. So recommendation is given on the monitoring frequency, and there is also a recommendation given on adding toxin binders in the final feed. This calculation is made on the own data, but this calculation can also be made on the data on aflatoxin in maize from all the mycomasters in the region. In this case, it is Asia, and the risk is then 11%. So in this way, the user will have a benchmark information. This picture summarizes what MycoMaster and the NutriOpt Mycotoxin Advisor is delivering. It starts with real-time analyzing with a MycoMaster and comparing the results with the risk levels. Customized advices are given, and with that, the user will be able to improve the predictability of their results. So that brings me to the last slide, and NutriOpt Mycotoxin Advisor in this way customizes mycotoxin risk management for the user situation. And it gives customized advice on a feed formulation. It gives input to improve the quality control program and to optimize the quality control program. And finally, it gives input to optimize the supplier management. And as this is the last slide, I like to turn back to Pedro and give him back the phone.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for your explanation. Certainly a lot of development in the area of analytics, and especially since you joined that company. I think that has been greatly improved as well. Certainly our focus has been to have a very practical tool, a tool that can be applied in the field, and that can be used in a daily basis. As you may know, Trouw Nutrition and Trouw as a whole also has a part of the production side, so we really want to make it relevant and applicable in the field, and I think that is exactly what we find out and the program is doing, especially with the combination between MyComasters, very simple tool to be applied at the feed mill level, and then a global database that allows us then to have a lot more insight and provide better recommendations to our customers. So in that sense, thank you very much, Alan. I would like to summarize it all in a sense before we go to the question and answer part of the webinar. And certainly when you look at our program, the main focus of it is certainly to work on the diagnostics, to work on a risk evaluation, because that's certainly the basis of then the recommendations and the solutions that we will provide therefore to the customer level to obviously increase the quality of the feed that is delivered at the production side. So it's very important to realize our main focus is certainly on this area, and therefore the tools that Alan just went through will continue to be a main part of the program. Within that, as mentioned, is certainly try to maximize also the efficacy and the efficiency of the methods and the information we can generate from either the individual mycomasters we have across the globe, but also to try to bring them all together in this global database in the Mycotoxin Advisor to be able to generate better recommendations. As Alan mentioned, it's all about data points, it's all about trying to make the data reliable and more predictable. And I think we are seeing our customers are all benefiting from the fact that they are connected in this global database, so that they see not only what is happening at their facilities, but also being able to do a comparison with the thresholds in their region. So we all benefit from that pool of data. We basically have a lot more data points to be able to make better decisions. And it's also, as mentioned in the first part of the presentation, about understanding the risk. And understanding the risk changes dramatically from year to year. So it certainly requires commitment from everyone involved within the team, and also to be able to understand the connection between the pre-harvest conditions, especially during the reproduction cycle of the main grains, and also the pre-harvest conditions, and also the levels of mycotoxins we're finding across the different regions. And so this connection is what really makes us having strong data to be able to do a better diagnostic and then do better recommendations at the farm level. This information also helps us to obviously help define the most effective solutions to counteract the effects of mycotoxins. So if we make our diagnostic in a positive way, so that is reliable, we are able to reduce the cost even on the use of adsorbents, for example, or mitigation strategies, because we are matching the risk to the solution we are providing. It's important to realize that the solutions we are providing are also backed up by close to a decade of research, in vivo research, and certainly a lot of commitment from the R&D team in continuing to develop the database that we have on the in vivo work that is part of the development of our product. So this is very key for us. It's key to demonstrate that our products and our solutions are working in real animals. And finally, as Alan mentioned, and I wanted to summarize it back, it's certainly about having an integrated approach. When you're looking at mycotoxin control or risk management, you certainly need to focus on diagnostics, risk assessment, risk control, but then obviously have the follow-up and continue to have information in a continuous basis, in a sense. So it's important to see this is quite in a cycle, and in the integration approach is the only way that we are able to counteract these effects. Having this in mind, Trouw Nutrition has invested clearly by increasing the prevalence of our technical group responsible on the Mycotoxin Risk Management team. So you see in blue the presence where Trouw Nutrition has facilities, production facilities, and then the growing team on the Mycotoxin Risk Management, which is obviously helping the Trouw and Trouw Nutrition mission to feeding the future and also feed to food safety. I wanted also to make sure you get our contacts, so if you, in case you have any additional questions than the ones that were generated through this webinar, so you see here my contact and Helen's contact for further questions after the webinar. And with that, I wanted to thank you for your attention, and we'll pass it on to Lourdes for the questions that were posed to the poll. Lourdes.
Yes, we already have a few questions in the Q&A panel. So the first question is for you, Pedro, and it says, Pedro, has the issue of mass mycotoxins been considered highly prevalent?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think in the last 5 to 7 years, mass mycotoxins have been brought to our attention, especially with the development of methods as the LC-MS method. Mass spectrometry is able to identify not only the parent mycotoxin, if you want to call it, but also the conjugates of these toxins. So certainly this has been published, and that there is obviously a lot more toxins and their conjugates, and that are quite important to equate on the risk, the total risk for the diet. As MasterLab, and Helen, you can jump on this as well, is also developing a method for LC-MS as well that we can add to the current program that we have. But it's important to realize when you're looking at the application of MyComasters and the NutriOpt Advisor, the goal is to be able to make decisions rather quickly. So usually when you're using a HPLC method or a LC-MS method, while they can bring attention to these other mycotoxins and also mass mycotoxins, we basically are not typically have access to a very quick method. So it's important to use the methods for the specific reasons that we want to use them for. They have stronger points in different directions. In our case, we really wanted to make it practical. We want feed millers and produce managers to be able to make decisions quickly. So in summary, yes, it's important. We can also test for those, but at the same time, we basically are looking at a very practical approach and to help make decisions faster. Ellen, any thoughts on that?
I think you gave a very good answer. I have only to add to it that as MycoMaster is a lateral flow method, the method in itself, using antibody reactions, is picking up different mycotoxins. For example, the T2 and HT2 already tested in one test. And it's very hard, but that needs more investigation, what conjugates are picked up with this method. So in a sense, it's a method that is picking up already a broader range of mycotoxins. But I fully agree that the MycoMaster is indeed set up to be able to make fast tests and fast decisions, and can be used outside the laboratory. Yep.
Thank you, Ellen. Next question then, Lourdes.
We have more questions. So the next one says that the Mycotoxin Advisor is a web-based tool. Can it be used when offline? Is the data uploaded automatically?
Yes, the data are uploaded automatically once MycoMaster is connected to internet. So once you do a test, it is then automatically uploaded. And the advisor is indeed a web-based tool, so it can only be used online.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, as just from the experience we have across, and I think in Asia Pacific, in specific, we had that experience with our colleagues there. it's quite impressive as you see it work. Obviously, as soon as you do an analysis, and if you are connected, obviously, to a web line, you basically see that information popping up directly into the advisor. So I would say, in practice, the information is right. It's real life, and I think that's unique actually in the industry, and that can really have an advantage to. For example, when you're trying to identify suppliers of grains, or you're really at that port of entry at the feed mill level, that you're trying to make decisions how to store, or how to formulate with those grains that you're finding. So it's really, as mentioned, we try to use the information we got from the field in terms of the needs they had, and I think rapid analysis is one of them, and certainly NutriOpt is equating to that need.
Thank you. We have more questions. That one is for you, Pedro. Again, the mycotoxin absorbents are a general term. Are all mycotoxins be able to be absorbed?
Yeah, very good question, Lourdes. And then, I don't know exactly who posed that question, but I think it's a very good point, especially because when you're looking at these categories, highly competitive category, and there's really a lot of confusion in the field in terms of what is effective. Should we look at binders, or should we look at some other strategies that are bringing different ingredients with different mode of actions? Certainly from our standpoint, the fact that we develop a product range trying to really focus on, first off, obviously a very good binder based on smectides, in a sense that is the one that is they are the one component that is basically proven and that is has high efficacy, high affinity for mycotoxins, as aflatoxin, for example. On the other end, we know certainly that there are toxins, because of their molecular weight or due to their polarity, that are not able to be bound. So there you need to be looking at other mitigation strategies, and that's certainly what we have on our portfolio as well, to try to reduce bioavailability of these toxins by increasing, for example, gut health, and reducing the passage of these toxins when they are at that level. So certainly I would say, if you look at the solutions we have today, we certainly are looking not only at mining, but actually to reinforcing the animal's natural barriers, I would say, not only to mycotoxins, but also other endotoxins and other pathogen bacteria that can add to the challenge of mycotoxin contamination. So it's certainly part of the strategy, but when you're looking at mycotoxins are more, the molecular weight is higher, we really need to have a more complete product, which is the basis of our product portfolio.
Okay, thank you, Pedro. Moving to the next one. Next question: when doing a report, can you use more than one main material? Ellen?
Thank you for the question. There is within the report the option to choose by the raw material. So a report is linked to one raw material, and of course you can select another raw material. So it is linked to one raw material. Is that answering the question?
Yes, it is. Moving to the next one, that would be for you, Pedro. Some species are at higher risk for some mycotoxins. How do you manage this in practice if we produce feed for different species?
Yeah, I think, again, a very good question. So it's good that we have audience that is able to bring them up. Obviously, they show that they have experience on this area, and I think what basically Helen explained in terms of the application in practice of MyComasters and NutriOpt Advisor is certainly the answer to this question. When we have feed mills that are producing different species, obviously in the case of either integrators, and you may have that happen, or commercial feed mills, the fact that you're able to have very quick results from the analysis really gives you the power to then either reformulate the diets to include a certain percentage of those raw materials if you identify that they are high contaminated, or then move them into species that are less sensitive to the toxins you're finding. So I think obviously that depends also on your operation. If you are able to then store the grains in a dedicated silo and to then be able to manage that even in more detail, I would say. But certainly it's very relevant that you have information in hand as early as possible, as soon as those grains enter and the storage of the feed mill. And in particular, when you have multi-species, that can give you an advantage to try to reduce then the contamination and the impact you have on the specific species you're managing.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one last one. That would be for you, Ellen. How can you analyze TMR, forage or finished feeds?
Very good question. And as the MyCoMaster is using a lateral flow method, finished feeds can be tested as long as they are dry. So when the dry materials, dry feeds can be tested with the MyCoMaster. So for TMR and silages, that's a difficult matrix to test with this method.
Thank you very much, Ellen. And for the other questions, because there are lots of questions in the Q&A panel, we will go through them, and either Ellen or Pedro will get back to you with the answer. So thank you very much for your questions.
Well, thank you, Lourdes, and thank you all for your participation. I'd like to thank Ellen also for a valuable contribution this morning and this afternoon for Asia Pacific. As a follow-up, you will receive a link to the recording of this webinar, and don't hesitate to contact us with the further questions, as Lourdes mentioned. Again, please feel free to share the link with anyone that you feel that is interested. We also will repeat the same webinar this afternoon for the other regions that couldn't be with us today. So looking forward to see you in the next opportunity, and we certainly will be bringing you more information as we will continue to develop the database and our understanding on this particular area. So thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed the information presented.
Thank you, Pedro.
Bye.